Hey everyone, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing director here at CinemaBlend, and we are going to explain the ending of the new X-Men film, Dark Phoenix. Naturally, that means we're going to have to get into spoilers, so if you haven't gone to the theater yet to see the latest X-Men movie, you're going to want to bail out right now. For the rest of you guys, before we press play on describing the ending and what it means for the franchise, go down, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and every single time that we post a cool video like this on the CinemaBlend YouTube page, you'll be the first to hear about it. Let's talk about what happens. Naturally, there's a big confrontation between the X-Men and the people who are working for Jessica Chastain. She's a part of an alien race who is trying to capture the Dark Phoenix Force, and the Dark Phoenix Force now lives inside Jean Grey. So, the X-Men are trying to protect Jean. The alien, played by Chastain, is trying to get the Force, and it comes to this big confrontation on a train. The X-Men break free, fight on the train, use all their powers in tandem, while Jean takes on Jessica Chastain and her people. It comes down to a fiery confrontation where Jean Grey and Jessica Chastain are each grabbing each other by the throat, wrestling back and forth, and then they kind of just combust. They explode. And Jean sacrifices herself to not only destroy the Phoenix Force, but to eliminate this dangerous alien race and protect the team. She sacrifices herself for the X-Men, and she does it in front of the people who mean the most to her, primarily Scott Summers, who's played by Ty Sheridan, primarily Charles Xavier, who has put himself and Jean in this position by exposing Jean to the space mission that gets the Dark Phoenix inside of her. And, you know, the team has to sort of wrestle with the fact that they were unable to save Jean ultimately and protect her from the Dark Phoenix Force that lives inside of her. We do get to see, as the movie draws to its conclusion, the ramifications of Jean's sacrifice. The X-Men are mourning. They rename the school after Jean, taking Charles Xavier's name off of it. And that's important to note because Charles, over the course of this movie, has been established as, you know, the villain, but I'm going to use villain in quotation marks, because he's essentially just, it's a different side of Charles than we've ever seen in the X-Men universe before. He's giving in to his ego a little bit. He loves the fact that the team is now accepted as a noted brand of superheroes. Heck, he has an X-Men phone on his desk that connects directly to the Oval Office. It's the reason why they go on the space mission at the beginning of the movie, is because the world basically relies on the X-Men to protect them when things go wrong. And Charles loves that, because for years they were outcasts, and for years they were running from people who wanted to persecute them, and finally now they are accepted, and Charles likes it a lot more than he probably should. He gets called on that by Mystique often, and that's part of the reason why Mystique puts herself in danger when Jean is starting to rebel with the Phoenix Force. So the X-Men at the end of this movie are turning away from Charles Xavier, and of course we do see Charles at the very end of the movie. This is the final shot in the movie, in exile. He's in Paris. He's away from his students. He's lost the school. He's no longer the leader of the X-Men. Beast has now assumed the leadership at the school. He's the one who's primarily going to be running the team. And Charles is in Paris, sort of just rethinking his next few steps because he's lost almost everything that matters to him. Well, who shows up? Of course, Eric, his longtime friend, played by Michael Fassbender. Magneto and Charles Xavier together in a Paris cafe, which some people have joked feels a little bit like the end of Dark Knight Rises, but it's not necessarily that. Instead, they have a nod to Bryan Singer's early X-Men films, where Magneto has brought a chessboard. He asks his old friend if he'd like to play a game, and we know that when Magneto was imprisoned in the first two X-Men movies, Charles would often go to confer with him, and they would play chess, because while they are on opposite sides of the coin, they're not quite mortal enemies. They both know that they have the best interests of mutant kind in mind, and they just approach it from different perspectives. Eric's is usually a little bit more aggressive. So Dark Phoenix ends with Eric and Charles playing chess in a Parisian cafe, but it doesn't quite end there, because as you're watching it, you predictably can say, oh, the camera's going to pan up and we're going to see the Phoenix in the sky. And that is exactly what happens. The camera pans up over the city of Paris, and we see the Phoenix going through the sky like a comet, which means that, what does it mean? Jean didn't necessarily sacrifice herself. Jean died, but the Phoenix lives on. We're not quite sure. And here's why all of this matters but doesn't matter. the franchise is over. Like, when we went to the junket and interviewed the cast, the studio very clearly said that this is going to be the culmination of the existing X-Men franchise. And the reason why that's happening is because of the merger between Disney and Fox behind the scenes. Disney now owns Fox and has the rights to the X-Men as characters, so they are assumedly going to absorb the X-Men into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, I think it's going to take years before they do that. They'll keep the franchise on the shelf for a little while because, first, the MCU has plenty of characters through which it would like to explore on its own. Captain Marvel's going to get a sequel, Black Panther's going to get a sequel, they want to introduce characters like the Eternals and Shang-Chi. That's all fantastic. But they're eventually going to get around to bringing in the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, but they're going to be MCU versions of those characters. So I don't think you're going to see actors like Sophie Turner or Ty Sheridan. You won't see James McAvoy as Charles Xavier, and I'm sure Fassbender's done playing Magneto. So I think that the Dark Phoenix people, if they knew 100% while they were shooting this movie that this was going to be the culmination, you would have had a more concrete ending. Because this is very much an open-ended ending to a film that's supposed to be the end of a franchise, the one that's supposed to put the stamp on the end of the saga. But it also notes that there have been many published reports that Simon Kinberg had to reshoot his ending a couple of different times for a couple of different reasons. The first suggests that there was going to be a battle up in space where Jean was going to take on the alien race, played by Jessica Chastain, in a scene that would be very reminiscent of the way we saw Carol Danvers taking out Kree ships in Captain Marvel, and they had to sort of reconfigure their ending because they didn't want it to look too much like that. I also tried to get some insight from Simon Kinberg about his ending and why he decided to change it. So when we sat down at the Dark Phoenix junket in London, I talked to him about reshooting that ending, and he told me this.
It was a less grounded version of the movie. It was a less, I would say in some ways, it wasn't a version of the movie where the X-Men and the family we weren't as focused on them coming together at the end of the movie. It was really more entirely Jean, and what it lacked was the sort of emotional closure. Thinking of this movie as the sort of culmination of all of the X-Men movies, where these strangers have become this, sort of surrogate family, and then in this movie they get challenged like they've never been challenged before. It felt like at the end of the movie, it would be much more satisfying for the audience to both see Jean, have extraordinary power and end up literally in space, but also see the X-Men come back together as a family in a new form. So I sort of wanted the both.
Now I want to know what you guys thought about the ending of Dark Phoenix. Was it satisfying to you? And if you didn't know that this was going to be the culmination of the X-Men franchise, would you have wanted to see the story continue? Truthfully, I wanted to see a different ending for the Phoenix, and I wanted to see a more concrete resolution to the entire franchise. I just thought after all these years of X-Men movies, they should have been given the chance to sort of go out the way that they wanted to. Of course, all these behind-the-scenes negotiations between Disney and Fox means that we're going to see a new version of the IP, and maybe that'll be what's best for everybody. Just a fresh start for the franchise in general. So, go down to the comment section, let me know what you thought about Dark Phoenix overall, and specifically the ending. And of course, while you're down there, again, hit subscribe, turn on your notifications, and every time we post an analysis video like this here on CinemaBlend's YouTube page, you guys will be the very first ones to hear about it.
When I lose control, bad things happen to people I love.
The girl dies.
She's still Jean. We can still help her.
Jean!